Apprenticeship. Learning to love, serve, and be like Jesus with Rebecca and Douglas Pereira.
Hello, and welcome to The Apprenticeship. I'm Olivia, and I'm an apprentice of Jesus. I'm learning from my parents, Rebecca and Douglas Pereira, how to love, serve, and be like Jesus. As Rebecca and Douglas's daughter, I watch my parents closely. That's similar to how we can be with God. As His children, we can imitate Him. We look closely at this concept today. Let's review our apprentice's creed. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your mind, and with all your strength. Love others as well as you love yourself. Don't forget there's a study guide for this episode. You can find it on our website or by scanning the QR code.
In His footsteps.
Welcome back to the apprenticeship and our journey through the Gospel of Luke.
For the last 2 episodes, we have looked at Jesus' circumcision, His naming, and His presentation in the temple. We discovered that each of these seemingly mundane events were actually very, very meaningful.
Today's touching story is filled with joy.
That's right. It's the story of Anna. You can find it in Luke chapter 2, verses 36 to 38. Anna was also at the temple on the day that Joseph, Mary, and Jesus were there. By divine coordination, she walked by as Simeon spoke with the family. She immediately recognized who Jesus was. She praised God and then told everyone who will listen about Jesus. But before we go any further, let's have our son Christopher tell us this week's memory verse.
She came just as Simeon was talking with Mary and Joseph, and she began praising God. She talked about the child to everyone who had been waiting expectantly for God to rescue Jerusalem.
The first thing we learn about her is that she was a prophet. This fact instantly raised her in the reader's respect. We can also infer that she was waiting for the Messiah, like Simeon. The passage does not state this explicitly, but a close reading of the verse can give us that picture.
The next thing we learn about Anna is that she was of the tribe of Asher. Her heritage shows us that she was a Jew. After King Solomon, the kingdom of Israel broke in 2 kingdoms, the kingdom of Judah to the south and the kingdom of Israel to the north. 2 tribes remained loyal to the kingdom of Judah, where Jerusalem was. The other 10 tribes aligned themselves with the northern kingdom of Israel. This kingdom quickly descended into total rebellion against God. Their apostasy led them into Assyrian captivity. From there, the 10 tribes were scattered. They were sometimes described as lost tribes of Israel. And here, Luke tells us that Anna was a descendant of an apostate and lost tribe. Yet, she was a prophet in the temple, praying and fasting to God.
Once again, Luke points out that Jesus is for all. Even for those who might feel like their history is too dark, like they are too unworthy to be loved or accept. But that's not the case. Anna is proof that God loves all and accepts all who turn to Him. Moreover, He even has a special work for them to do, as we'll see in Anna's story.
After learning that she was a Jew, we find that she was an elderly widow. To a first century reader, her age would command respect and highlight her dignity. Her status as a widow was qualified by her constant presence in the temple and her devotion to serving God. Now that Luke has established Anna as reliable, what happens next?
We see Anna joyful accept Jesus as the Messiah. She saw Jesus, quickly understood who He was, and immediately began praising God.
Yes, she didn't stop with praise. She then went to tell everyone else who was expectantly waiting that the Messiah had indeed arrived.
Through the stories of Simeon and Anna, Luke's telling us that reliable, respectful, and expectant people like Anna and Simeon saw Jesus, understood him, and accepted him.
Both Simeon and Anna model an aspect of the kingdom mindset we've been describing. They model expectancy. They expected with great hope and confidence that God will fulfill his promises. At this point, thousands of years have already gone by without the fulfillment of God's promised Messiah. And they are both very old. Yet, they didn't waver in their expectations. They patiently waited, despite what felt like a very long delay.
You know what, Rebecca? I have something that can help us to understand this point. I have what in my hands?
That is an Advent calendar. It's for counting the days until Christmas, right?
That's right. The Advent calendar represents something beautiful about expectancy. Each day we open a drawer. It's so fun, right? Yeah, and the kids usually love as well. We are filled with expectancy and anticipation. Anna's story teaches us that hopeful expectancy is not passive waiting. It is active. It is worship. It is sharing our hope with others, just like opening each door of this Advent calendar.
We can follow the example set by Simeon and Anna. We can hold on to our expectancy as we wait for Jesus' return. While we wait, we can remain confident that it will happen.
And as we wait, we can, like Anna, eagerly share our expectation that Jesus will fulfill his promise to fully establish his kingdom. We can share our confidence in all his promises.
In his workshop,
We've been exploring what it means to be created in the image of God.
Last time, we looked at how being God's image means we are princes and princesses in his kingdom. We are his children, so we are royalty.
Today, we will build on that concept. We are God's children. So, what can we do as God's children? We imitate God. Our creation in God's image naturally implies that we're called to imitate him. Paul said this explicitly in Ephesians. Watch what God does, and then you do it, like children who learn proper behavior from their parents. So, what does God do that we are to do?
In Genesis, we find our first calling. Then God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and govern it, reign over the fish and the sea, the birds in the sky, and all the animals that scurry along the ground." Here, we see that our first calling was to procreate and govern. Why would that be our first calling? Because that is what God did, and he shared that purpose with Adam and Eve. God expanded his kingdom by creating the world. He filled it with life of all kinds, and he gave a measure of this creative, expansive power to Adam and Eve by giving them the ability to procreate. And just as God governs the entire universe, Adam and Eve were to govern their corner as God's vice regents. We are to reign as God reigns.
That sounds very noble. But let's break it down a bit. What does it look like to reign as God reigns? In the creation story, we see God lovingly prepare the world like parents prepare their nursery for the arrival of a baby. God provided everything needed to ensure a flourishing life, and He sustains life even today. So, as God imitators, we are to reign with love as providers and sustainers. We are not to be takers, but givers.
We were created to steward God's creation, to care for it as He cares for His entire kingdom. He entrusted to us to ensure that His kingdom ways are carried out here.
We've been using the term reign, but let's be honest. None of us feel like we're in a position of rulership.
No, at least not most of us, right? But our role as God vice regents extends beyond rulership. It encompasses all areas and activities of life. It is a question of how we do things.
We were created to do all things as God will do them, to do them in the same spirit and in the same manner. I know we're all familiar with the old saying, "What would Jesus do?" Well, we can and we should add to it, how would Jesus do it? That's what being imitators of God is all about.
When we are properly aligned with God, everything we do can fulfill our mandate to represent God's rule on earth. As a father, I can represent God, the Father, to my children with His same love, tenderness, patience, and eagerness to teach. As a pastor, I can represent the Good Shepherd to my church with the same humility, self-sacrifice, grace, and willingness to train. As a member of society, I can represent God in the way I conduct myself and relate to others. I can ensure that people are provided for and that their dignity and value are protected.
There are so many ways that we can practice reigning as God does. Again, the guiding questions are, what would God do and how would He do it? We do the action and we honor the spirit behind it.
But there's a danger to reigning, especially as sinful people.
And what is the danger?
The danger is that our reign can become exploitative and destructive. Look at racism, for example. And its byproduct is slavery. Look at environment issues. So often we reign for our own benefit. We are supposed to reign as a sustainers and providers. But tragically, that is not what we always do.
Sadly, that is so true. But right from the beginning, God built a protection for us. That protection is the Sabbath. Let's look at Genesis. So the creation of the heavens and the earth and everything in them was completed. On the seventh day, God had finished His work of creation, so He rested from all His work. And God blessed the seventh day and declared holy, because it was the day when He rested from all His work of creation. God delighted in His creation, so He rested to enjoy it. As His imitators, we rest on the Sabbath too. And there's where the protection of Sabbath comes in. Sabbath is a weekly reset. We're reminded of our call to reign as God reigns.
Sabbath is a weekly reminder to lay our rulership before God, to recognize that God is the ultimate ruler, to remember who He is and how He reigns, and then we can return to reigning as He does.
Sabbath is also a weekly reminder to stop sustaining and recognize our utter dependence on God. And Sabbath is a weekly reminder that God is our sovereign, loving, created King. Sabbath protects us by helping us maintain a proper perspective of reality.
Sabbath is truly a blessing. And so is the broader concept of imitating God. God has made it clear who we are, what we are to do, and how we are to do it. In addition to being the example, he gave us the perfect example of how to imitate God in our sinful world.
And of course, the perfect example of imitating God is Jesus. Paul explained in Colossians that Jesus is the visible image of the invisible God. The way Jesus lived shows us what God is like.
And that is what we're called to do as God's imitators, to reflect Him to the world the way Jesus did, to do what He does: love, rescue, provide, sustain, transform, create, forgive. To do all these things in the way that He does them, lovingly, with self-sacrifice, mercy, grace, and benevolence.
There's still more to explore on this concept, so please join us next week. For now, let's consider our key questions. What is God doing in my life? Do I have the courage to be a part of His work? Am I truly willing to join Him in His work of redemption in my life and all around me?
The Rescue Worker.
Heather Elmendorf was 7 years old when she went down a river in an inner tube. Her father, Fred, followed behind with Heather's 5-year-old little sister in his lap. Unexpectedly, the water sped up. It rushed over the rocks hidden beneath the surface. Heather was further along than Fred. Horrified, he saw her fall out of the inner tube and into the water. She did not come back to the surface.
Fred knew he had to get to where Heather fell out. As he drew near, he saw her pinned by water against a rock. He reached down, took hold of her, and pulled her out of the water. She clung tightly to Fred as he paddled them safely to shore. This story is a reminder of how God rescues us. He knows our situation. He knows that we are pinned down by sin. He knows what we need to be saved. He reaches down into the waters, rushing over our heads and pull us out. In His grasp, we can breathe and live.
And just as Heather clung tightly to her dad, trusting in Him instead of in her own power, we can cling tightly and confidently to God. This brings us to what we'll talk about today. We've been discussing how God has rescued us and made a way for us to be put right. But there's one more point we need to consider. Heather trusted in her dad instead of in her own swimming abilities. We need to trust in our God instead of ourselves.
We have talked about how legally and spiritually speaking, we were condemned to death, and rightly so. Jesus saved us from that penalty by hanging in our place. But His sacrifice was more than a transactional act to satisfy the law. He made it possible for our rescue to go deeper than just our legal standing. Jesus' sacrifice made full transformation possible. Because of Him, we can be changed from the inside out.
That's right. Jesus not only took the penalty of our sins, He also made a way to rescue us from its power over us if we have faith in Him. But Douglas, what is faith actually?
That is a great question, Rebecca. There are a lot of misunderstanding about it. How about we start with what faith is not? Anything that is any way makes me my savior is not faith.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Many people confuse faith as something you do to prove yourself to God. They mistakenly hijack faith as a way to earn their rescue. They seek to prove the quality of their faith or how big it is. Please, don't misunderstand me. There's nothing wrong with being faithful, devoted, trusting God, and growing our faith. The problem is when the focus is actually on ourselves. It is subtle, but it is still self-centered. Anytime the I need to prove, I need to earn, I can do it, motivations come, it is an indication that self is at the center rather than God. Faith is something more like this. I once heard an analogy of two people who boarded a plane. One person had full confidence in the engineering of the plane, in the pilots and the crew. They boarded the plane. The second person was terrified of falling from the sky. With hammering heart and shaking body and anxious mind, they also got on the plane. Both passengers reached their destination safely. Both passengers exhibited faith because they both got on the plane.
I see. They both exhibited faith because they accepted that they could not get where they wanted to go without flying. So they got on the plane that could take them there.
Precisely.
So faith is accepting that I can't save myself, but Jesus can. And he did. That's the faith plane. When I get on, Jesus can take me where I need to go.
That's right, Rebecca.
This is radical acceptance. It refuses to let self sneak in with its subtle suggestions that maybe there's something I can do to get myself where I need to go. Just as those passengers couldn't flap their arms and fly to where they needed to go, I can't do anything to save myself. I must rely completely on Jesus and what he's done.
Faith is the radical response to God's radical love. Faith puts God at the center of everything. Faith leaves no room for self. Let's pause a moment and explain what we mean by self. Because of sin, self is enthroned in each person's heart. When Adam sinned, he not only abdicated his dominion over the world, he also abdicated his heart. Rather than having his loving Creator King enthroned in his heart, Adam's self-centeredness seized the throne. This led him to shift their sin to Eve. And she did the same thing, blame shifting down to the serpent. They each wanted to protect and justify themselves. It is a condition we have suffered from ever since.
That is so true. Self is the usurper in our hearts. The king of the universe should be on that throne, but instead, it's ourselves. This is why Jesus said self must die. He said, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross, and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you'll lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. Jesus wanted us to understand that self-centeredness is lethal. What do I mean by self-centeredness? I mean the notion that our rescue depends in some way on ourselves, that we can earn it, prove it, or muscle our way through, that we have some reason to thank ourselves for how good and saved we are.
Self-centeredness must return the throne to its rightful king. Only then can we fully live the life God has prepared for us. Paul wrote, "My old self has been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. So I live in this earthly body by trusting in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." So long as we cling to our own will and ways, there is no room for God to work in us. We are thus still under the power of sin, living like slaves even though we have been freed.
It is very sobering to think how self-centeredness was Lucifer's downfall. He was so in love with himself, he thought he could usurp God. And that's precisely what happened in each person's heart. Self has usurped God.
That's right. That is where faith comes in. Faith is accepting that our dependence is on Him rather than our own selves. We must allow the rightful King back on the throne in our hearts. Paul often referred to Jesus as Lord. In English, the title Lord gives the picture of a nobleman, a gentleman. But Paul's understanding of the word Lord was greater than that. We know he meant that Jesus was king when he called Jesus Lord. In English, I think we would more likely say, Your Majesty. But for Paul and those he wrote to, even Your Majesty did not encompass the whole meaning of Lord. To them, Lord meant a combination of Your Majesty and Your divinity.
Wow, I didn't realize that. So in the Greek Bible, when Jesus is called Lord, the writers are saying something more like Your Divine Majesty.
That's right, Rebecca. And that is who must sit enthroned in our hearts if we are to fully put right again from the inside out.
Yes. When the rightful King sits on the throne in our hearts, we experience radical transformation. We recognize that everything depends on our King and not on us, even our rescue.
But for that to happen, we must daily depose the usurper and we must daily allow the rightful King his rightful place in our hearts.
Today's episode has given me a lot to think and pray about. I hope it has for you too. If you missed our other episodes, you can catch them on Hope Channel Canada website, on the Hope Channel app, and through Roku. And don't forget the study guide for today's episode. You can find it on our website or by scanning the QR code.